Hi, hello. Ah, yes. Good afternoon. Hi, everyone. And thank you for being here for our second annual lecture at NICHE. So that means, I guess, we have to and I'm Francesca Tarocco, the director of the new Institute Center for Environmental Humanities at Professorial University of Venice, therefore NICHE, quite a mouthful. It's our moniker. And NICHE, I remember, in fact, very fondly, our first phone call about that. I remember you were very encouraging. That was more than a year ago. One of the first people I talked to when we were embarking in this new enterprise NICHE. So this, as you know, is a place, a nice building we have here in Venice. We do a lot of water-based work, but one of our aims really is to engage with scholars and thinkers, as well as artists and practitioners, and all of these things Elisabeth Povinelli is herself. So all the more grateful we are today for having her. Now, someone last night told me Povinelli is a rock star, so and I'm gonna say that. In fact, she's right there, Barbara Casavecchia. So yeah, so Povinelli is a rock star, doesn't really need an introduction, but I'm just going to say a few words and just to remind us how much you have done for us. So Elisabeth Povinelli is a critical theorist and filmmaker and an artist. She received her PhD from Yale University and is currently Professor of Anthropology and Gender Studies at Columbia University in New York. She has many books and numerous essays and publications to her name, and she has worked with her indigenous colleagues in Northern Australia for over 35 years. And yeah, sorry, I'm getting old. The date of the PhD. And is a member of the Karrabing Film Collective and one of the founding members of Karrabing Film Collective. And Karrabing, of course, is here in Venice with us. And we just saw, in fact, last night, the latest film, Fishing with Ancestors, Night Fishing with Ancestors at Ocean Space, the beautiful space, Ocean Space. That is one of the sister institutions we are collaborating with. The other institution we are collaborating for this series of events is the Professorial Theatre, where Karrabing will hold a seminar and workshop tomorrow morning. So first wonderful book, Labour's Lot, Elisabeth Povinelli, The Power, History and Culture of Aboriginal Action, Chicago, the University of Chicago Press, 1994. I'll skip, but yeah, a book I really loved, of course, like many of us, Geontologies, a Requiem for Late Liberalism, with Duke, The Inheritance, again with Duke, 2021. And last year, in fact, I saw one of your films based on that in Madrid, in Inheritance, where you are very beautifully engaged with your ancestral path and present. Today's talk is entitled Rising Tides, Melting Glaciers, Semiotics after Geontopower. Elisabeth Povinelli. Thank you.
I must say, I'm more like a wet noodle today than any kind of rock. It's really great to be here. I am traveling with 6 other members, including 2 of my great. One doesn't say they. Sure. But do come tomorrow if you feel engaging in our and discussion of some of our artistic practices. Next stop tomorrow is to my quote ancestral village in what's now the Italian Alps, Carisolo, where we're going to stay for about 5 days and hopefully do a little film work. And apropos of this trip and the potential research and artistic project that it might give rise to, I want to today present some really very preliminary comments about this project, and it's going to be kind of wild. It's different parts kind of crammed together, but also I'm hoping that we'll see the basic outline and also perhaps some of the stakes of the project that right now we're calling Rising Tides, Melting Glaciers. The project, this Rising Tides, Melting Glaciers, seeks to model how to conceptualize two ecological histories of the present from a decolonizing perspective. And the rising tides and the melting glaciers refer to two very particular political ecologies and histories. On the one hand, the melting glaciers side is centered on my Povinelli family's and Ambrosi's historical relation to Carisolo, which is just on the other side of Pinzolo. And a lot of people know Pinzolo because it's the ski place. They say, where's Carisolo? And I say, well, Pinzolo. And they say, oh, Pinzolo. There's a long history there. Anyways, specifically for the melting glaciers, we're thinking about the clans of my father's parents. On his father's Simonaz clan of Povinellis and his mother's Baruca clan of Ambrosi. So that's one side. So we have clans on that side. And that's the melting glaciers. On the other hand, we're centering on the clans and totems in the coastal lands of the Karrabing. More specifically, those clans and totems, and take all these words under, big old scare quotes. But around the coastal point of Mobiluk and stretching down to Bamiak and Banagaya, where the film that we showed last night is centered. So Fishing with Ancestors is on Mobiluk, and where some like 30, we don't even know how to count these fish traps or this matrix of rock fish traps, but let's say 30 fish traps weave around Mobiluk, and they're crucially important dreamings or totems, Hedwin for Emiangle and Wachamal. So here, those it's rising tides, melting glaciers, and we seek in some ways to engage what Dipesh Chakrabarty, of course, in his very famous 4 thesis essay, talked about a shared climate crisis, a globally shared climate crisis, but not shared in the same way. But we also seek to push back against an idea of a common world, or what we mean by a common world. Okay. So, and that's going to matter when I kind of outline what I mean by the difference between geontopower and geontosemiotics and a semiotics after geontopower. But to get there, I'm just going to like plow along and just give a bare history of these two regions and how the various ways we can think about their relationality. So if we're going to talk, what I want to do is, rather than a kind of abstract common world, how do we think about these regions and political economies as radically relational all through history? So it's this kind of sedimentational approach rather than, say, even a historical one in terms of time. So in a kind of bare history, just to lay out some of what's at stake, let me just say that in a bare kind of historical facts of Simonaz, the Simonaz clan of Povinellis, we can say that, just to give you a little, and I apologize for these slides. I built them on a plane, so they're not very pretty. But we could say that Povinelli emerged, we know it emerged as a nickname of Bartolomeo in the late 1400s. It became a surname in the 1500s, all in Carisolo, and it split into clans in the mid to late 1600s. So but this history of a name that is, Povinelli, like a nickname, so it's in dialect, refers to a particular kind of cheese. So, Bartolomeo, the cheese guy. but it's also a history. The history of name is a history of human and land relations and all its particularities. So Bartolomeo, the cheese guy, was living in Carisolo, this small little village on the Sarca River, huddled under the Alps, which was part of, since the 1127, part of the domain of the Prince Bishop of Trent. And as such, Carisolo and other villages around it, including Pinzolo first, was part of what they called the Carta di Regular system, in which villages and the vicini, that is the from Latin, the vicus, were allowed to produce a certain kind of semi-autonomous power to regulate their common land. So it's a kind of commons, but of course, it's not a democratic commons. There's nothing democratic about commons. It's based on the opposition between vicini and forestieri, right? The strangers. And again, it's not liberal strangerness. It's not people I don't know. You might know these strangers. They're just from somewhere else, right? They're not vicini. And again, in this little region in Trentino, the Carta de Regular system starts in 1127, but what we see is that in the 1500s, when Bartolomeo, the cheese guy, sorry, I shouldn't call my ancestors the cheese guy, but say in the 1480s or 1490s, we see a rapid increase of these little villages, and they're very small, petitioning to the Prince Bishop for rights to create their own regula, right? So in the beginning, a couple of the bigger villages had them, but by the time we hit the 1500s, we see a rise of population pressure, right, in the area, price inflation, and social transformation. So that increasingly, historians have shown the exclusion, the way in which women were allowed to have property, women start being pushed out of having property, right? And it really more and more just is a capi fuoco or capi familia kind of system. Why? Well, one of the things we know is that at this very time, this is the time when all the silver ingot is flowing into Naples and other port cities, but certainly Naples is a very important one, leading to population expansion, to price inflation. And all these, although, you know, Naples and the Alps are in some ways quite far away, nevertheless are some of the fracturing and sedimentations that are impacting the world up there. Now, again, not a democratic commons, please. Not the tragedy of the commons either, because of course there's not an individual who's maximizing his profit. These are capi familia, these are families, and these carta are based on rules and obligations. You must, you have to, you should, don't you even think of doing that, right? They're just filled with like finger wag. And then prices for penalties, you know, a good piece of coin, a bad piece of coin, et cetera, right? So how to use and maintain their commons, which are, you know, these alpine flats, which a little bit of pastoralism and then Alps, so a lot of forest. Now, all of this comes to a crashing end. So we have population, we have price inflation, and we have more and more of these villages creating I confini, right? So boundaries, right? This is ours. And then if you go into the archive, it's all this, the litigation, I liti, are all about like so-and-so went over the pastures, and you have villagers saying, we always used it together, but increasingly that use together cannot work anymore. Okay. Even this comes to an end in 1805 when Napoleon comes over the mountains. And although he's defeated, the Habsburg Empire decides to use Napoleonic administrative system because they're trying to figure out how to fit into this new mercantilist and capitalist world. So what we see is a privatization of the commons and administration at the distance. And as a result, there's really good studies. Oh, sorry, this is like some of the documents that start trying to figure out where exactly the borders of various villages are. And this one is in 1700, so they get even the cartography is really interesting how it's imagined. by the yeah, so right after, and again, I meant to throw the slide on here, it's somewhere down the line, we'll see it. Anyways, by the 1820s, the privatization of land, administration at a distance has called an ecological collapse. Like the pine forests are just clear cut. And villagers, especially up in the Alps, get a new trade, sharpening mill wheels. That is what is it, wood mills. They become knife grinders. All right, oops, where we went on pause. Now, my great-grandfather, that's that guy up there, and that's Candida. She's from Pinzolo. Was born in 1869. Now, 1805, 1869, so far away, but one has to remember, and this is the inheritance, what I try and get at the inheritance is that he is in the world of his grandfather as well, right? So he is growing up with his grandparents, fully embodying this idea of dispossession. We were dispossessed. And as a consequence of our dispossession, you know, we're starving, the mortality rate is dropping, you know, these guys here, but this idea of dispossession is full and embodied. Now, by the 1930s, however, he and most of the Simonaz Povinelli, our clan, and the Baruca and Brosi, my father's mother's clan, have disembarked from the Alps and set up knife grinding shops in Buffalo, New York, and New York City. That is the dispossessed, and again, it was really fully embodied. And you know, 1400 to 1800 and onwards, like 400 years of this idea of semi-autonomy, in no way seems to have affected the consciousness that those people dispossessed in the Alps could go to the US because others were dispossessed before them. That is, they arrive in Seneca lands. And by the 1960s, early 1960s, my little natal family, my father and our little crew, is now in Louisiana during the period of violent racial conflict as the Southern schools are, as the federal government's trying to desegregate the schools. So Ku Klux Klan. And again, we're down in Caddo land. We're the Caddo. The Caddo were displaced into Oklahoma, a kind of racial politics. Now, 1869, when this grandfather of mine was born, no, great-grandfather of mine was born, it's the same year that the British began settling Darwin and surrounding coastal lands. Now, earlier than that, the Dutch, and much earlier than that, the Dutch and the French around the 1500s were cruising around the coast. So I don't have a pointer, but that little ding up in that, see that little U there over here? Just south of that, that's where Karrabing lands are, or coastal lands are. So the Dutch, and this is a Dutchman, the Dutch are trying to, they're engaged in this kind of mad mercantilist race to find spots where they can extract resources, bring them home, add value, and then re-export. And in particular, they're trying to find a route to China via Macassar, which is again in night fishing with ancestors. It's all about Macassan because Macassans were engaged in trade in Northern Australia, not colonization. Now, Karrabing, now, so if you go, so 1869, my great-grandfather, but that's when the North is being colonized. The effects of colonization are much earlier, probably around 1600 when diseases start going. And when in 1930, when my Simonaz clan is the dispossessed taking advantage of the others' dispossession in the north of Australia, the government is creating a reservation system. Right? So my great-grandfathers are, and my great-grandmothers are moving our clans out of the village because everyone's dying there, and they move them over into Seneca lands. Meanwhile, the state government and federal government are moving indigenous people, including Karrabing ancestors, onto a reservation system. And in particular, they move them onto a place called Delisaville, which is now Bellewen, where Karrabing were born. There. There's some of their parents, the great parents of the younger generation, parents of the older generation. Now, these ancestors of Karrabing were wards of the state until the 1970s. I'm in Shreveport. There's violent white supremacist reaction to desegregation of schools. And in Australia, Indigenous people are still wards of the state. In 1976, the Land Rights Act is passed. It's very important. Was passed by the federal government about the Northern Territory, where Delisaville is, where Karrabing ancestors were forced into reservations. But it was based on a very conservative anthropological model of clans. And this is where, like, one of these problems is like, how do we intersect these histories? Well, this idea of Vicini with its Iconfini, right, with its borders, that is a descent group. You pick it up, like in my family in the Semiotics, we pick it up through our father and our grandfather. That's where we're told. There's no village. We're still told that. My older brother still thinks he's a Cappy, and we say, you're nobody, right? But this idea of a bounded land in which Vicini or local families who passed down rights and obligations through the father line became the basis of the Aboriginal Land Rights Act. And as a result, it cut Indigenous lands into these, what we would say are these non-democratic common lands. Okay. By 2008, there was a huge backlash because even though this was like a model that wasn't actually relevant to Karrabing ancestors, it nevertheless gave some power to Indigenous folks who were able to get their land back. So, you know, as the Alps are becoming more wealthy with the ski economy, but there's not these commons. In Australia, under this very conservative model, which divides lands, there was at least some power to negotiate with mining companies and development. So there was a backlash. And the federal government in 2007, under this Emergency Intervention Act, withdrew a lot of the powers of Indigenous people to organize and control their lands. Okay, that's a kind of skeletal idea here. Now, you already see that one of the issues here is how to think about, one of the things we're trying to think about is like, how do we think about the relationship between these areas in which now in a political ecology of climate crisis, on the coast, we see these rising tides that are flooding, covering the Dreamings and flooding the freshwater swamps where a lot of both the kin relations are, more than human kin relations are, and also hunting, but also the melting glaciers, which are collapsing this kind of cushy ski economy up in the north. So how do we think about the relationship between the two? Do we think about them in terms of a comparative history in which, well, let's see how we did land and let's see how they did land, we'll just compare them, as if we could pull them out of their historical material sediment and conditions and then compare them in abstract space? Or do we think about, and how do we do that, think about the effects, the differential effects of this moving history of colonial re-territorialization and sedimentation, so that as one set of actions hits across the Atlantic and rebounds into say southern Italy, Naples, and other ports, then creates effects that ramify up in the mountains, that propels other ships around the coast, which ramifying effects over here, so that you have these ramifications of dispossession happening across the globe. How do we think not of comparison, but about the strategy by which different people responded to these ramifying, terraforming actions? And if we start that way, get rid of a kind of comparative mindset, but try and stay in at each moment the kind of plane of roots and worlding, then I think what we have to do is think about the way in which each one of these forms of dispossession were simultaneously creating new forms of relationality internal to Europe and in relation to others. So for instance, it's absolutely true, and it's still in my family. I mean, so like only in America probably, but there was still this passing down from my father's parents of a sense that, Elizabeth, you're a mountain girl, you come from Carisolo, we're the original Vicini, blah, 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 right? And then the French and the other ones and the Italians came up and blah, blah, blah. And everything was great until they got rid of the commons, and then everything collapsed. And indeed, my grandmother's brothers starved in the First World War. It was, it was horrible. So we have this environmental catastrophe that leads to a form of population displacement. And indeed, the very labor, the very skills, the very bodily powers that my father's mother's side and my father's father's side had, that is knife grinders, that's what they did, came from the forces of this dispossession. So their families were the ones that sharpened the blades that were just cutting through these pine forests in the Alps. And indeed, some of these social relations migrated with them when they took advantage of other people's dispossession. So when they went to the US finally, and my great-grandfather dies, my great-grandmother, who you saw sitting with my grandfather, sorry, takes over a Vidova role, a kind of widow role that was within this Kartsa system that had not existed in nearly 100 years, right? And because the Vidova, the widow, could speak for the family, because she was speaking on behalf of her dead husband, right? So in the knife grinding business that they set up in Buffalo and New York City, Candida, the widow, takes the role of the head of the family, but not in terms of stuff. But in a world in which there's no carta de regula, right? So it hangs on. But note, all of this shows the way in which our dispossession, and and again, we were dispossessed, and the stakes of that. My father's mother was, she was pulled out of the village in the 30s, married off to my grandfather, the 20s, married off to my grandfather. She really held that, and we saw it. We saw the psychological damage of dispossession. She just wanted to go home. She wanted to be buried with her bones. All my ambrosia are there forever, she would tell me, and they were forever in the ground. But we were dispossessed into possessive individualism. We were dispossessed into being able to possess others and possess other lands. Not so with Karrabing. Karrabing, when dispossessed, were dispossessed, as Glenn Coulthard says, into a more radical form of dispossession. That is, first extermination, then assimilation, and depending on what time it is, forms of incorporation that fit white government, and then reactionaries, right? So where we're dispossessed into possession, they're dispossessed into, from a settler's point of view, hopefully annihilation. Right? With all the, and as we're dispossessed, we can take advantage of the dispossessed, and over time, of course, there's a lot of economic and ecological, although, contested support for economies in the north, right? And right now with the melting glaciers, it's like, okay, what do we do? How do we switch economies? Do we go to, more sportif? Do we use plastics? Do we use the water to make the snow, et cetera? But there's a sense that those people who have benefited from dispossession should continue to benefit. So how do we do it? Whereas again, in Australia, this more radical form of dispossession, those who were dispossessed lands are now looked to as a source of minerals, say, minerals, water, and et cetera, to power the new green economy, right? So there's a continual sedimentation of differential possibilities, even though we're talking about two forms of plants that were dispossessed. And thus the impact of climate change is also differentially ramifying. You could say, well, the glaciers are melting, the seas are rising, everyone shares that world, but the effects of it socially are still being differentiated and politically. All right. Now it goes weird. Is that all right? Now we go. So that's basically it. And in some ways, I think, well, that's simple. I mean, this is not a hard thing to think. I mean, it's hard insofar as like, how do you tell the story without recapitulating certain epistemological categories, for instance, especially say up in the north, where originally we had Lega Nord and then Lega and et cetera. And thus both on the, it's interesting. There's a lot of really great literature on this. The Lega Nord was very, some of its ideological proponents were very clear that there were this idea of this kind of Celtic difference was a myth. They knew it was a myth. They're not saying it was real. Instead, they're saying we're mobilizing this myth kind of in a Gramscian way. So we're doing a kind of political mobilization, using the legends of, the sun or the Celtics or whatever, the Bardies, in order to mobilize a sense of a we community. Now I forget where I am. Okay, so here we have this kind of understanding of, so how do you do a kind of relational history when, again, on the one hand, a lot of on the critique of, say, white nativism is to push against these kinds of myth making, right? To push against the idea of a kind of nativist us, which is mobilized against immigration, et cetera. And we need to be clear, of course, all the way through that, say, Lega Nord's anti-immigrant stance with this kind of Celtic thing hanging on the opposite end is not the same as, say, Vicini and Forestieri, because they're within different social worlds. But there's so, just from a kind of social historical point of view, it's simple and it's tricky how not to fall into, especially if you think Karrabing, we're also talking about facts about their land, say their totems, the way in which the movements of these ancestral totems literally shape the landscape. How do we critique myth in the Alps and yet not critique myth in Karrabing? Why? Because it's not a myth in Karrabing. Right. So how do we say Karrabing's discussion of how the land was formed by the movements of these more than human ancestral dogs and fish and yams and et cetera are not myths? And we say to Europe, you created the distinction between history and myth, so you be regulated by it. Karrabing refuses to be regulated by the distinction between myth and history because it's not their epistemology. Okay, so what's simple at one level becomes much harder because now we have to differentiate amongst epistemologies. Like, how do you critique one place within a certain kind of social understanding of history and myth and fact and legend, which we see all over the Alps. Like Carlos Magno did not stop the Carisolo, no matter in Stefanov, there's a big thing there because we know the documents, we look at history, I go to the archive, etc. But we don't do that in Karrabing because that's not ours, because that is a colonizing epistemology. So all that's going to be in there. The second thing that I've really been thinking about, this is, again, the sideways one. And I'm going to just give a kind of outline here because it's really too much, is how to think about these epistemologies, these epistemological differences within the way in which these two clans, the melting glacier side and the rising tide side, were absorbed into Geontopower, right? And how can we rethink, and this is especially for niche, how can we how can we rethink the human relation to the more than human world, both in the Alps and in Karrabing lands, without recapitulating the sort of categories in which you can use anywhere. But let me give an example and it'll become much clearer, hopefully. Oh, sorry, see, they're out of order. Here's the mortality, the effects on the loss of common lands in Carisolo on that side, etc. And that's the plummeting of population in Australia around the same time. So again, there are all these parallels, but and you see them, you say, oh, parallel, but the social effects and the are radically different after you get through those lines there. Whoops. So just remember, you don't have to, this is just a slide from Geontologies. And again, for those of you who don't know, and there's no reason you should, the term Geontopower or geontology is meant to work as a concept or a way of trying to get us to see that that existence is not divided between that which has life and non-life, not that which is dead, but that which never had life, like a rock or the inert, but rather a mode of governing existence that has a very long history in Western philosophy. So you can stretch this division of life as that which has a potential to be born. Well, yeah, can be born, is born, and then insofar as born can die. And then the politics and the ethics are measured in between life and death, or being and non-being, based on how much potential has unfolded, right? And you get Agamben, you get Esposito, and et cetera. And this division became the basis of fundamental epistemologies, like the division between biology and geology. And that, in a nutshell and very, very crudely, is Geontopower. But this very old way of thinking existence that you can really stretch out and look at all the arguments in it and the discursive field becomes weaponized during settler colonialism. That is, this division between life and non-life, or that which has potentiality over the course of its existence and that which is inert, is used to locate different human worlds. So, for instance, Karrabing ancestors, Stone Age people, right? And the stone is really important because they're inert. Can you kill a stone? Is there any ethical implications or political implications of getting rid of a stone? No, right? So this mobilization of, well, this is an inert civilization, and thus will go back to where it belongs, right, into the earth, was of course mobilized. And then other peoples are organized relative to that. Again, just diagrams from Geontopower and geontologies, so that you get this way of oops, can you see that up here? Not so much, but anyways, So it's a way in which societies are separated based on this underlying matrix of this idea of progressive potentiality and inert past perfectness. All right. So one of the things I've been thinking and inspired, if we're thinking about rising tides and melting glaciers, is engaging in the literature, the critical literature that's been trying to think about how to pull the more than human into a relational thinking, communicating, politically and ethically endowed space, right? So mountains have rights, and trees think, and forests think, right? So how do we build out a political, social, and relational world in which humans are not the only ones who have the power to communicate, interpret, intend, and thus have some place in the political. So anyway, so I've been thinking that hopefully it's so here, biosemiotics, right? We know biosemiotics. And biosemiotics in some ways have been around a very, very long time. We can think before even Bateson, but let's just use Bateson, and it's certainly our good colleague Eduardo Cohn's work, and others, all of whom have been working with a model of semiotics, in which the interpretant, right, that which can interpret a sign that stands in relation to an object, can include more than human world, right? So say biochemical processes in leaves, communication amongst roots, various forms of, we wouldn't use language, but nevertheless interpretive systems amongst biological entities. And with Bateson, of course, these weren't this idea of mind. So the interpretant, with Peirce's, the interpretant is in a mind, right? So the object it determines in some ways, one way or another, the sign that creates for this is Peirce, perhaps a more developed sign in the mind. Now, someone like Bateson said, get the mind out of the box, right? So the mind isn't in a container, the mind is between things. So someone like Cohen is trying to think about how the mind of the forest is between the trees, right? Between the birds and the trees. Or for Bateson, the mind was between the play of this Gibson hound and a gibbon and this, I forget what, quiche-hound or something. As they played together, right? As they interpreted each other and created a new pattern of play, a new mind developed. And then we have Gaia as the big mind, right? All of this excluded non-life. Rocks do not have mind. Rock, well, or what about sand and water and sand bank? So creeks and sand bank. Can we say that there's some object and a sign that it more or less determines, that sets up in the mind another more compelling sign? And for a very long time, everyone's like, no, this is a biosemiotics. It's got to be something that it has a potential for interpretation and growth. So one of the technical questions is, if we're thinking about melting glaciers and rising tides, in which so crucial in the playing out of these, including back when they were trying to think about how to deal with both the pines and the granite, but also, of course, in Karrabing lands where we have massive tides, some rocks which are, were put in place by ancestors to form fish traps, others that are the sedimentations of ancestors. So the very sand itself, we could say, is a part of the bodily sedimentation of those ancestors who've been living there for 30,000 years. How do we get non-life into this semiotic process? How do we say that forests and winds thing? Where's the wind? How do you get it in? Now, I'm not going to tell you, I'm not going to go over this. Let me just tell you, it's a real technical problem. Because Geontopower, because when Western philosophy divided existence into the inert and life, all the philosophical, all the epistemological effort was put into the uniqueness of biological mind. And then add on to that the way in which language, human language, became the hierarchy of semiotic process. And again, I won't tell you how, it's all hidden in that little sign over there. Excluded from that was non-life. It simply is inert. So in semiotics, we have in all of our models laid into that the same kind of geontological framework as anything else. I have to just say, trust me. And I can tell you why, right? In which the mind that holds this interpretant can't be inert. Then it's an object, right? And not only, and you see this sliding here is because the object determines the sign, sets up the mind then acts on the sign. But of course, how the mind acts on the sign, how the mind acts on the object changes the object. So that's why the sliding over here. So you might end up changing until you don't have glaciers anymore. And the algae forms have changed, and the bacteria have changed, and the seas have changed, right? And we're all good at that. We can say, oh yeah, we set it up. We said these aren't real totems, there's a myth. And so we can act on it without having any kind of legal obligation. And what do? We change the object. So it's not the object anymore. It just keeps on changing. You see that? So cool. That's what we can do. But how do we get those rocks in it? Now, I sit there, oh yeah, I can do it. And I think I have, right? I was like, oh, I figured out a technical way of getting out of this. Now, what do I do? And so I create a model in which I can show how to show that non-life can work within a semiotic model. Thus, I can take the melting glaciers and the rising tides and put them in the same framework, right? I can say, as with the Alps, so with Karrabing lands. And maybe I could do it all the way through with the kind of sedimentational force. And what am I doing here? Right? And especially if my goal, as I began this talk and how I ended, was to think, how do we think about the relationship between melting glaciers, rising tides from a decolonial perspective? Is the answer to, on the one hand, we take two sets of clans and compare them? Well, no, we have to show how the abilities and strategies of each of these ancestral moments was differentially determined by how they were slotted into Geontopower. Do we say, oh, we can show, like, that Karrabing's relation to their not only more than human world, but more than what we would say life world isn't just, and this would be the goal, isn't just a myth. It's true. Look, I can show how the rocks do listen, right? When they say these sets of rocks are this ancestral family. I'll show you with my geontosemiotics how those rocks actually do. Well, what am I doing? Am I lending my effort to bolster their claims by showing how they can fit into a theoretical model that refuses geontopower? But insofar as doing that, am I creating once again a sort of abstraction where, again, I started this talk, kind of abstraction that says, oh, see, all the world is the same world. All of it fits within this geontosemiotics. All of it includes forms of non-life. Or instead, do I say, what is semiotics after geontopower? Rather than using conceptual models to prove what Karrabing say is true, what would happen if we push the limits of these models? And just like we refuse to use myth as a way of analyzing Karrabing relations to their land, we simply refused to use the kind of conceptual model building we use in the West in Karrabing locations, and instead said, you know what? That rock does listen. You either are allied to that claim and you lend effort to those who seek to maintain that truth, or you don't. And the conceptual foundation of that claim lies within their world, not ours. Thank you. I told you it was a bit of a wild little turn.
It's lovely. Okay. Well, thank you. This was, we only had 1 minute, so I have to quickly still. Thank you, Elizabeth, for this very rich and inspiring talk, and for really and for the effort. I mean, not only theoretical but practical effort to look at these entanglements, historical and in present times. I'm sure there's many questions from the audience, so I'll open the Q&A, and people online, please do write in the chat. We have a hello, people online. Yeah, yeah. I'm afraid the Zoom link was very late, so but the talk is recorded and will be published if it's okay on our YouTube channel. So questions? Yes.
First of all, many thanks for the really inspiring lecture that you gave us this afternoon. Well, I am a landscape researcher, so I am a bit. It sounded a bit, so everything a bit new, but many things were related. I've been recently researching glaciers in the Dolomites, so the point was basically that you referred about relating about the landscape of the mountains, the idea of dispossession, and also the need to rebuild the sense and the will of community. But the point is that basically, specifically for the matters of glaciers, the narrative of the death of a glacier is actually becoming the new will of making community. And it's so, at least strange to me, that you set a death date and you build up a sense of mourning and grief towards a non-human. And this also relates to me to another book that I've been reading that is called Do Glaciers Listen? Do Glaciers Listen? Yes, it's a book by an American researcher of course, my pronunciation will be the worst, but it's Julie Critchell. You know her. Yeah, super. Well, the point to me is very strange, and I wanted to feedback from you, because at the same times you assign life in order to elaborate the depth of this melting biologic entity. And at the same times you do it in order to keep community alive. But yes, it sounds quite contradictory to me. I wanted a feedback from you. Sorry for.
Do you want to keep a few, or take a few, or shall we take a few questions? Yeah.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you so much. A Davis lawyer question. Sorry. For the only thing that I find difficult for me to understand in your proposal, in your discussion, why can we take? I try to say it in my terms. Why do we take seriously the epistemologies of the Karrabing and not the epistemologies of the identitarian local people? Because it is true for them what they think and what they say. I mean, it's completely true, but it's a truth. It's a more problematic truth for us, you know. Yeah. So why should we take one form seriously and the other one, thinking that one is a myth and the other is not?
Said before, part of the inspiration for the project is, and you know, the inspiration in some ways for the inheritance was indeed this non-passage, contradiction, whatever we call it, between, and here I'm going to talk about the more progressive laws, or where we would, maybe many of us would say we are, say, instead of just bash the white nativism. That is, we support indigenous rights and struggles and claims of land and etc. But we would also find it very, very difficult to figure out how to re-belong to place. Like, okay, really? Povinellis are going to go back and re-belong Simonaz to Carisolo and exclude others? Exactly, right? So there's a tension. And I think it's a tension that provides a non-thought and thus an opportunity for a certain kind of white nationalism, nativism. That tension. So the project is, okay, how the hell do we think these two spaces in such a, sorry, I swore and we're on recording. I always do. Someone said they watch every single YouTube I ever did. I always laugh and I always swear. Okay, but how do we put these two in relationship to each other such that we don't create a false equivalence? Right. And that's what, when I was part of each one of these steps, it's hard for me. For instance, you know, the debates about you know, the Pendino region, or what actually happened in the Upper Sarka, you know, very heavily on Western historiography, like archives and facts and myth and what can be proved and what can't be proved. So there's an entire apparatus of historiography that we know. And we would have to say, and that's, I was trying to say, we'd have to say, you know what? You invented that, that applies to yourself. regulate yourself by that. Not only that, you like Carisolo, let's say, just localize it. You yourself have materialized out of that way of regulating. Epistemology as governance, literally have materialized out of that. That epistemology, that analytics, that relationality matter isn't a Karrabing one. Why should they have to be regulated by it? Right. So what is that saying? Well, there's not a thing, but there are these, again, radical relational forms of not truth in the abstract, but truth in the making world. That is, if I say in Karrabing land, if I say where these fish traps are, if I with Natty and Rex and etc., who's Cadwin, or you would say Totem, is this point, is this little coastal point, and it's a fish. It's where this saltwater fish lay down, and it's, you know, it's the fish. You can easily see it. If I say I stand by that truth, am I saying it's true in the way we say Carla Magna did or did not walk through Carisolo is true or false? Well, I would say that when I say that is barramundi, that point is a barramundi fish, what I am saying is I'm viewing the world based on that relation. And when I say I'm viewing the world based on that relation, then if it's Rex's in, then we can't do certain things to it, right? It jams certain kinds of operations. It's a radical pragmatist truth, right? Versus, well, wait a minute, you know, in what sense is it true? Which are opposite. So that's one thing. And then the geontosemiotics is built out of that kind of thinking, which is like, well, what we're doing, trying to find a model in which we can say what is true or what is not true for everything, for the Alps and for Karrabing, or are we saying this is a form of governance that literally built out of this history and built the materiality of that history? That's the best I can do. But because if not, you're right. It just sits there and you say either the Alps or Karrabing, right? So we need some other, and it's very difficult. We need some other way of maneuvering between these spaces. Does that help a little bit? I don't know if it's the answer, but it's I think what we have to do. I'm not kidding.
So first of all, thank you very much for your speech. I wanted to jump into this discourse because I feel it's quite relevant also for my research. What I feel probably be an interesting point is also grounding on the idea that stem also from Karen Barad. So this idea of semantics physics, or the system that you use to read a system, let's say it's a little bit tautological, I know, but basically changes what you can observe from that system. And I feel probably this kind of, so deciding which truth is truth really depends on the point of view of the person engaging.
But I don't think so. Well, I agree with you. That's what we would say. But there's something much more dangerous that I'm saying, I think, because I'm not saying it's from the point of view. I'm saying if you can treat the world under a certain kind of conceptual framework, you materialize it in one way. if you treat it under a different conceptual framework, you materialize it in another way. And thus, our political thank you. The political stakes. The political stakes is why you would lend your effort to one kind of treating the world under a certain kind of analytics rather than another. So then you have to say, well, wait a minute, am I contradictory to say I'm not going to treat my Povinelli land under a, leave aside Lega North. I mean, that was always crazy, but not even like, I'm not going to go back and argue for a commons or something like that. But I am going to argue for not a commons in Karrabing, but I'm going to lend effort to a different way of thinking about the relationship between land. This isn't in the abstract, well, in a physics sense, this is more, I think, more radical, which is there's no ground here. There's no way in which I can say, the physics says, don't worry, the world works like this. So you can relax. That's what an ontological or a science built out of a certain kind of ontological. The world is like this, relax. And I'm saying, no, you can't. I'm part of that generation. There's no ground here. You either decide to lend effort here to literally materialize this framework, or you lend it there. And for me, that effort is the decision about that effort is conditioned by the history of differential sedimentations. That is the movement of purified substance into one place, right? And the building of more and more comfort and wealth, and the disavowal of the effects in another place. So in some ways, it's just a stubborn, it's like, I want to counterflow it. I want to pull some out. I don't care about particle physics. I just want to pull what's accumulated here back over there. if we want green energy, I don't want it sucked out in behind Bellevue and Community. I want it sucked out. I want the mines to be over here. And so I think that's it's a great question, but I think that's why I always push against even the smell of a kind of ontological first step. Right. So, Jack Butler now, but Jack Butler was, we start with philosophical conditions. We start with humans are born into precarious state, and the social is the way in which this precarity is distributed. Right. And then politics is built out of that, and then you have history. And I say, no, I don't need that first step. I don't need the comfort of the world is like this. It's a hard one. Yeah, it's a hard one. I don't think we have, what's surprised that we don't have ways of thinking like this or models for doing it. Our models and ways of thinking emerged out of Geontopower, which is created. This is the whole thing. So we always are falling back into it. Yeah.
Thanks. Pardon?
Thank you so much. This was so thought-provoking. Have one piece of ethnographic factoid, which has to do with the Alp. Yeah, so not that long ago, I found myself on top of one of those peaks, and I bumped into this. Well, we would call it a legend or a story, a tale about a lady who turned into a stream, a creek after a supernatural encounter. brought this at you just because I suppose that the Alps are a space of colonial engagement and history, right? And I don't think that we can flatten everything in terms of, kind of hegemonic epistemologies that ended up probably being naturalized by a lot of people up there. But there might be elements and stories and counter stories that complicate the picture. And, I'm not saying that there's some kind of totemistic straight, obviously, but there might be encounters ahead for you that will disturb some assumptions, not yours, but, shared assumptions about the way the West works, right? That's what I'm trying to get at. And the second thing I wanted to ask comes from a place of anthropological engagement with axial traditions and Islam and Christianity and this kind of stuff. And actually, we wanted to ask this question since I read Geontopolitics and has to do with God, like the idea of God, of course, in other corners of anthropology is getting quite big. And I wonder if, like there are ways in which epistemologies and ontologies of forms of existence that transcend life and non-life have been with us and have been with people for a very long time. And I wonder, obviously it's not your project, but at the end of the day, the picture that you provided and you operate with, it is in a sense a secular one. And this division between life and non-life, which you critique, doesn't necessarily stand from, say, for example, an axial viewpoint whereby everything is alive in transcendental way. So I wonder if you have any answer to that. Thanks. Sorry.
I have to remember everything. The first, 1, 2, 3, 4 of us was Linda Yarwin, Rick Singh, Aiden Singh, and I went to our village, my village, right before COVID. And the Semiotics Povinellis all scampered off. There were none left. They were all left, and so did the Baruch and Broses. And so the village archivist, the village genealogist wanted to fill in the family tree. So I was brought into the office, and again, these are my Karrabing colleagues, and they're watching and laughing, and then they're like, "This is what they do to us." Blah blah. But then they also went to church and they saw the old things, and and they asked, they said, did you guys have totems? And in some ways, this basically this project started probably the first moment I got to Belyuen in 1984, but it really restarted there. And it's like, how do you answer that question? How do you even approach that question, right? And what's the stakes of answering in the way you did, which is better, which is how do you probably, I don't know, but we don't live then, no one lives then, we live in the material effects of this history of governing the difference between myth and history and fact and stuff like that, right? So I of course, that in Finland, there are places, there's a beautiful place that a lake that was shaped when a red stallion pulled out of the ground and left the water behind. And indeed, there's can be a celebration of that kind of, we don't even know, myth. Without, see, this is the thing. Let's say I go to my Alps and I find the creek that was formed by the woman. And I say it's a creek formed by the woman. Let's go back. What does that do to, what does that make me? What does it make me? And because that statement flows through a certain kind of body, it makes me into a certain kind of thing. Because I'm not making the statement, I, as a dense set of social relations, are making a thing. What happens when, say, Nati says this is her, right? It produces a different kind of thing. You see? So I'm always pushing against this idea that we say, well, there was this was here and this was here. It's like, no, it's constantly constantly making and remaking within a given matrix of difference. You see? Yeah. Okay. So that's what I'm really just kind of pushing because we're, again, when I say we're, those of us who were socialized into certain kind of semological, like Snapchats, tend to go there. That's what we tend to, well, I found an example of it. And we don't think about, yeah, but in saying it, I'm saying it in this matrix of relationality. Okay. The second question, oh yeah, the God thing. Well, you know, one of the things that I try to say very clearly, and it has to also do with, do we want to if we need a new kind of semiotic theory that goes beyond the division between life and non-life. What, Beth? I don't know what I'm saying. But the God help my little brain fused thing. What? When I was ask me again, and then my brain will click. Great video. So yeah, I know what I was going to say. One of the things I'm trying to say is that concepts, we should not, like, again, it marks my age. Concepts are not something that you develop so that they can be applied to anywhere at any time. Right? Concepts are ways of articulating, to use that old-fashioned, articulating an actual world so you can see how it's operating. Well, what that means is that they come from not a locality with boundaries, because of course, but the way in which these historical forces are meeting and operating here. That means that the concept you pull out to be able to see it better is going to have some relevance along that network. Right? But it also means that it's not going to have the same exact effects when you move it across that network. And also with Geontopower. Like, the point is not to say, well, here's the newest and latest concept that just go and apply it anywhere. No, it really came out, it's clearly relevant in these indigenous worlds. But then when we take it and try and think about it in the Alps, ooh, it starts moving in this weird way. So once you start seeing it, like, whoa, like put it over there and a whole different like little house starts being built, you think, well, what are the subtending social, political, etc. relations that are distorting it so it looks like this? Thus with God, right? If you move it around in Islamic, various Islamic worlds, of course, yeah, it's going to deform. The God itself is not a problem because, you know, the anchor of this hierarchy was always, you know, in some ways the Christian God, and then of course secularism. Yeah. So.
Yeah, and all sorts of things happen if you move that to Asia and Chinese religion. Maybe two more questions. What do you think? And then
Thank you for such a fascinating presentation. I just want to continue from where you left. I was thinking, writing from the margins, for example, looking at margins as a place of possibility, but at the same time also recognizing that there are also hierarchies in the margins, right? So even in terms of, say, the conceptual category or categories that we choose to pick from the margins, how do we negotiate which category to sort of, or what concept to pick up, knowing that there are also hierarchies or divisions within that indigenous world? So that was one thought I had.
my answers here are always really insufficient because, and again, I really think it marks in some ways how I emerged into this gig, but how do we know? We can't know. Because there's not going to be a ruler, like a ruler, that is going to give us the kind of certainty and surety that I think we want. Instead, it's kind of maximalized. I mean, it's so weird. It's a little like, you know, Peirce's abduction, or like Sherlock Holmes. You maximize as much relational knowledge as you can, right? And how those, say, the hierarchies in marginal, or we say marginal frontier spaces, relate to other kinds of hierarchies and marginalizations. And then you do your best in terms of pushing one way or the other. And I know this might seem like a way of getting out of the question, but there's no other way. It's like, okay, well, there's hierarchy. Like, how do we think about, I'm not going to, there in Karrabing, there's tons of stuff we talk about. We know, we live it. It's like, yeah, but that is related to, say, settler governance in such a way, if you push that, this reaction is going to happen. Okay, so we can't push it that way. What about pushing it this way? Oh, look at that, right? So you even insofar as internally you're seeking to alter a formation depending on where you think it should be, which is always what's happening, right? You also know that every pulling one way or the other is going to pull the ways in which it's connected to formations of power that you didn't even know. So rather than deciding, it's this constant maneuver and strategic field. Sorry. And can I also add one other thing that's really fun? You will have been wrong. And we will have been wrong, not because you chose the wrong, you know, you chose the wrong pony or something like that. But we will have been wrong when we're successful. That is, we were able to maneuver it, say in the margins or wherever, maneuver in such a way, like a queer theory, we're able to maneuver in such a way that we changed the way in which gendered sexuality is thought about. But we changed it. And so we created a new world that looks at the old world as having been wrong. So you also have to bear that.
Thank you so much. I want to ask something more related to this distortion that you get when you shift around epistemologies, because so if you look at it historically, it has been very unilateral, as in European epistemologies have been applied to other places and have distorted very violently epistemologies elsewhere. But then currently, we're trapped in this epistemology that is doing extreme damage and that needs to be changed. And you have examples now of, for example, rights of nature, that is kind of, it's the other direction. And yes, transporting these concepts distorts both the concept, but it also distorts the European epistemology, which we might need distortion of. So I'm wondering if you could say anything about this, because yeah. Last question.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, we're trying to do this, of course.
Totally, like you know, and the distortion effects are unpredictable. So go back here. So two things. First of all, rights of nature. I have to say I'm part of the crew who says, yeah, that's like the politics of recognition. You can you know, and the extension of the legal apparatus was from individuals to corporations. Yeah. So now we're allowing nature in because we can think of it as a corporation. Okay, that's not a distortion. That's an absorption. That's not a distortion. That's an absorption. So that's one thing. The second thing is, I would say one of the things I've been thinking about, I'm probably just wrong, but that's never stopped me from making. You know, I think the decolonizing critique, that is the critique of colonization and the effort of decolonizing epistemologies and sort, has been way effective. And one of the ways it's showing up, however, is in white nativism. Right. So no longer can, you know, this idea of like an unlocated truth, an unlocated subject, a cosmopolitan, can maneuver anywhere, anything. It's like everyone, the indigenous, has a power now. And, you know, and thus one of the effects is, well, we're indigenous too. We had Oak Creek that a lady came out of. I mean, we met, yeah, sure. I bet the creek's still there. I don't know where it is, but it might be there, right? So also the distortion effect, go to your question, can be like, whoops, I didn't mean that distortion effect, right? And on the other hand, we have a lot of, I would say in some ways, younger people who are trying to think in various places that I've seen in Europe, in Italy, in Spain. How do we rebelong in a non-fascist way? Which is also, I think, the way in which indigenous critique is affecting them. And I think it is an interesting question. How would you do that in these various spaces where in this part of the world? And the answer is very unclear. I mean, how you would do that for reasons I think you were saying, like you might wind up like the fear of that kind of fascism. And then the fear that, oh my God, do we think indigenous people are actually? So I think that's right. That's a kind of distortion effect we want. And Geontopower meant to be a distorting effect in two ways. One, to distort, it's kind of a distortion of Western epistemologies and kind of, but on the other hand, a refusal to become a new concept.
Thank you so much. And please stay around. There's a few drinks and food to have. Wonderful. Thank you, Elizabeth Povinelli. Thank you. Yeah. More questions, perhaps you can mingle.
Or we should